Half an hour before Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak gave his "I'm not resigning, I'm just delegating some of my duties to my new vice president," half an hour before he gave that speech, our next guest could hear protesters singing the Egyptian national anthem from Tahrir Square a mile away. The protesters at that point had been told by the military that their demands would be met. And then came President Mubarak's speech. And since the protesters' main demand was that Mr. Mubarak step down, when it became clear that he wasn't actually going to, this is what happened. Watch.
Carnival-like atmosphere has turned to one of anger and resentment.
They've been saying the slogan that has come to symbolize the demands of the people. In Arabic, it is "Huwa yamshi," which means he must leave or he shall leave.
They didn't listen to the end of the speech. Halfway through it, when they realized that actually President Mubarak was not going to step down, they started chanting again, going, "Go, go, leave, leave, depart."
Joining us now from Cairo is Al Jazeera reporter Ayman Mohyeldin, who has joined us a couple of times in our coverage. Ayman, thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate you staying up till this horrible hour.
My pleasure.
Did it make sense that the protesters and a lot of other people around the world were expecting President Mubarak to step down? In retrospect now, are the reasons that was the expectation, are they reasons that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. When you look at the public mounting pressure both domestically and internationally, when you look at some of the key indications that became apparent throughout the course of the day from the military, that communique, and one of the most overlooked things so far has been the statement that came out from the Secretary General of the ruling National Democratic Party. Now, he was quoted by various media outlets, including this state-owned Ahram newspaper, as saying that the president had been asked to step down or transfer his powers, and that in fact he was going to answer the demands of the people before Friday. Now, when you look at what that means, the demands of the people have been very clear from the very beginning, and that is that President Hosni Mubarak must step down. There was a lot of evidence to suggest that is exactly what was being prepared to happen. That communique from the military suggesting that the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces was going to convene regularly, also a very important indicator. Unfortunately, though, in the eyes of the protesters, it certainly did not materialize based on all the evidence that was coming out earlier in the day.
Ayman, do you have any reporting, any indication of what might have happened between all of those things that you're just describing there, which we were reporting on here as well, and the evening when Mr. Mubarak actually did not step down? Is there any indication yet of what might have changed between those two events?
Well, at this particular stage, it's very difficult. We're getting a lot of analysis from different people close to the military. You know, and the military in Egypt is a very close-knit society. It is a very closed group of officers, very difficult to gauge their reaction. But I can assure you one thing from many of the people that I've been speaking to is that the military, just like the rest of Egypt, is very much divided on what to do. Some of those senior leadership of the military, very loyal to President Mubarak. Some of the younger officer corps, most of them trained in the West, spent a lot of time in the U.S., have very different opinions. But because the military is so close-knit, it's very difficult to gauge the initial response. But some of the analysis suggests that, in fact, President Mubarak was playing both sides of the military and the vice president without giving a clear indication as to who would emerge with that authority. Well, by the end of the day, we certainly learned that the vice president had been given the authority, or at least some of the responsibilities. And there's some indication that really caught the military by surprise. The military had essentially gone on the footing that it was prepared to assume more responsibility, perhaps play a bigger role. The fact that it was not and somewhat shunned aside is going to be a very interesting development to see what happens in the next 24 to 48 hours in terms of how they respond on the street.
I mean, the Egyptian ambassador to the United States told me tonight, this hour, that not only is Mr. Suleiman in charge of the military, there is no split between the government and the military. He told me that any statements from the military today that were interpreted as being more supportive of the protesters than the statements had been in the past was just a misunderstanding, that the Army's messaging has been consistent all along. They're just saying the same sort of things they've been saying since the start of the uprising. Is that how you see it from Cairo?
No, certainly not. The reality on the ground is very different than what the ambassador described. Now, there's no doubt that the ambassador perhaps is in touch with more regular elements of the military and perhaps the chain of command itself. But all you have to do really is spend time out with the soldiers on the ground, some of the mid to senior level officers that are in charge of some of these tank battalions that are out in the streets, and you get really a sense of the general mood for the military. Now, one of the events that happened today that was of great interest was that a senior army officer who was in Tahrir Square, Liberation Square, put down his weapons, according to eyewitnesses, and joined the protests. He was certainly showered and embraced by the protesters around him. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest that the military is in of itself somewhat divided about what role it should play. We've seen that time and time again over the past several days, and the comments that are coming out of the military have suggested that it has come on the side of the protesters on more than one occasion. The initial statements that came out that suggested that the military was not going to use force, and more importantly, expressed explicitly that the protesters had legitimate grievances. Those are strong indicators into the mindset of the military in terms of who it was supporting early on. That could have changed, but the indication and the evidence so far does not support the statements made by the ambassador so far.
Al Jazeera reporter Ayman Mohyeldin, thank you so much for your time tonight. Really appreciate it, Ayman.